Hello, welcome to another video, and today we're going to be looking at the prevalence of neck pain and how the impact of stretching can actually exacerbate a tight neck, which is sounds counterproductive. But I've got two people here in this video to demonstrate what we often see contributing to neck pain is actually the area of the neck itself, especially the upper trapezius and the levator scap, are actually being overstretched, which is why they're reacting in pain. So as you can see in this video here, if you look carefully, like from a front-on position might even be even easier, but Dylan here has got like a reasonably sort of normal shoulder. He doesn't have any neck pain or anything, by the way, so he's got quite a nice position of his shoulder, where Mel will have a real heavier slope coming down, and you would see this from the front-on position where Dylan's clavicle or collarbone would be sitting on an angle like that, where Mel's would be sitting like dead horizontal. Alright, so you begin to see how this becomes a problem when they begin to move, so especially when they move their arms up. So when they raise their arms up, there's a massive disruption in the scapula. You can even see this already, how Mel's scapula sort of winging out at the back here, and Dylan's does not wing at all. His is quite flat. You can't see because he's got a t-shirt on, but he doesn't have any winging. You'll see what happens as they raise their arms up. There's a real disruption in the timing where she overactivates all of this area, the levator scap, to actually assist in lifting her arms up, because what's happening is she's lost her ability to come out and wide, where Dylan's got a lot more space around the neck. He's really got his scapula moving nice in this upward rotation because it's not being held with excessive tension through here that's disrupting its ability to move out. So it has no choice but to get pulled up, and it gets pulled up by the levator scap, which attaches at the base of the skull there, which is why often that muscle is associated so heavily with headaches, because of the tension that's involved with it, just to lift your arms overhead. Now you can see there's like a disruption, and that's probably she's exaggerated that to show you in the video what happens. You see at the last bit of what Dylan just did then. If I just go back, you'll see how his arms will slowly coming down as he's see this bit here, and then just that last bit is where he's lifting his arms up there, is being provided by the scapula, where Mel's scapula is not coming out at all, it's just coming up, and you see all this tension really creeping into this area. So now this comes back to the point of like where she'll have the massive tension there, so your instincts are to stretch it, but it's actually being overstretched already. And you see this is when if you actually help someone when they're lifting when they're resting their arms by their side, you've actually lifted their arms up for them and put them back into this position where you could actually lift, getting it away from being in this heavy slope downward, and actually lifting him up there where her clavicle would be sitting on the alignment of that instead of there. That would make a huge difference to the tension on their neck. They would never have it anymore. So this comes back to what I was saying a minute ago. So the common thing is, instinct is someone to start doing this because they feel there's tension there, so they need to stretch it, but really they're just going to exacerbate it because they're overstretching. They're stretching what's already overstretched. It may give you a temporary relief, and that's mainly due to the reduction in the electrical signals being sent, or the nerves that are sending the message, basically turning the Wi-Fi down. But in the long term, you're creating a much bigger problem, because you're ignoring the problem is it's actually weakness, and it's often weakness around the scapula. Trying to correct it is difficult because you're going to really need to release trigger points first, which is what Dylan's showing here. Massages is probably way more effective, but again, by itself it's quite useless because the trigger points are reacting to the weakness of being overpulled. So until you resolve the weakness and the lack of strength at other areas, you're never going to really address this depressed shoulder that's pulling the head, or pulling the shoulders so far down. And remember, gravity is really doing a lot of this to you anyway. It's pulling your shoulders down for you already. So This is why a lot of people who don't do strength training, or they do things like posturally pulling their shoulders back and down, which you see a lot in Pilates and yoga, in the belief that it's good posture, all it's doing is creating a multitude of neck problems and scapular dysfunctions which lead to shoulder problems. So these drills here that Dylan's showing there are a couple of ways that you can use. I could show you a ton of different trigger point things, but I think a lot of you are quite familiar with that. Obviously, I would start to stretch through the neck and the front of the chest region. So the pecs, they can really become problematic as people sort of move into an like a hunched over posture. So releasing, especially through the pec minor here, really becomes a massive problem for the shoulder, but obviously the neck itself. So just encourages more and more neck flexion, which then excites the neck extensors to counter the neck flexion. So if the whole thing is, if you can strengthen areas that hold the rib cage in a better position and get the scapula to time itself better, you have all these things start to disappear and you won't need any stretches at all. Remembering stretching actually encourages more of the tension that you already have. Another big factor in all of this is the thoracic rotation, which anyone with neck pain would tell you how difficult it is just to turn their head around like that. And again, because all of this area is already being bunched up and chronically shortened off, the last thing it wants to do is do more of it, so it limits it. It basically stops you from rotating, which stiffens you up like a robot. So you'll end up like, instead of full range that Dylan had, you end up with something around about here, where the full range is like all the way to there. So a lot of neck pain people lose about this much, and they can't turn their head because their head is really bound by what's going on around the scapula here in the thoracic region. Very, very tricky thing to work with. Sometimes this drill here, it's great as an assessment, but not very effective for a neck pain person as a corrective exercise. It actually just causes too much pain. This one works the lower region. You can see how his head, how much it has to try and rotate. It can't do it if the thoracic is stuffed. If it's stuck too early, he'll lose all of that. And trying to force his neck through it obviously will just make things a hell of a lot worse. All right, so a very big factor amongst all of this that, and again, you don't really want to stretch the neck at all on this. And you can see also how the pec becomes involved here, because for him to open up, as in like that, this top pec has to release for him to be able to move like that, and this one needs stability on the ground here. So even though it's very basic stability, it still needs it. All right, so quite a complex topic to discuss, but the main point of this is to understand that you don't really want to stretch the neck to try and treat it. It's really going to be trigger point release followed up by strengthening and stabilizing of the scapula. All right, so there's some basic mobility drills. Now, once I've sort of moved through that, I can actually also, here's another trigger point one that I left out. This is using that same little rubber tool that you can use to find trigger points. This is where you can work through that thoracic. This is very, very painful. As you can imagine, if those muscles are all bunched up, short and tight, they're not going to enjoy this at all. So a massage therapist might use their elbows or their thumbs to achieve the same goal. But by yourself, this is how you would do it, something small and soft. Foam rollers are not as effective. All right, so that's another way to release those trigger points there. Now you really need to start working on the stabilizing and strengthening, which will really hold things in place. And this is just a basic Serratus anterior protraction exercise. And Dylan's just going to move into retraction there. So this is what Mel was sitting in before. She was sitting in retraction, so we see the scapula sitting out off the back and all in there, the rhomboids, the middle traps all bunched up short and tight, which, as we just saw, Dylan wouldn't be able to rotate if they were stuck like that. You would find that very difficult to do. So this part where he's just done a protraction, so this is where the scapula is moving out, and this is being mainly driven by Serratus anterior. And then all of this bit here is being stretched. Now this bit's being stretched, which is good. All right, this is going to allow your mobility to return, but it's being done not from stretching, but by being strengthened. All right, so very, very regressed exercise as such. Very effective in the early stages, not enough to change things permanently. It's just a stepping stone to the things that do change things. But very, very important. This is where once you're starting to derive strength in here, that's when the you're starting to get out of this scapula, this shoulder depression that's pulling your shoulders down. You're actually bringing them up, which is where they need to be, which takes pressure off this levator scap from trying to pull your scapula up for you to just lift your arms up. All right, so a very simple drill. Then it leads to the standing thing, which is what we saw at the beginning, but we turn it into an exercise, and we called this the wall slides, which I've featured many times on this channel here before. But you can begin to see the relevance of this exercise now from where it was at the beginning, and you can see how, like, the resistance of the roller, it's very minor, but it's just enough to encourage him to push against into the wall, meaning that he needs to have some sort of pushing like what he was just doing, but his arms are moving overhead. So we see this upward rotation of the scapula, and he's learning good timing of how to do it right so that it doesn't bunch up like what we saw Mel do before and being driven up into the neck. It's actually coming out being driven by the scapula. All right, so again, it's quite simple, but most people struggle with the coordination of it. The tight pecs become involved when you see, and Dylan does this well, but you'll see the pecs involved, if I just bring it to play it a bit more, with if his hands started to pronate. So see how his thumbs are pointing backwards to me? If I could see his whole hands, I know that the pecs are dominating and rotating him inwards, and that's where it's really leading to a host of problems again. So quite a simple drill, very good for the neck pain person to learn how to get their arms overhead without jamming their neck up. It's really just a coordination drill that eventually leads you to the strengthening side of things that make the big difference. All right, so they're very simple wall slides. I'd say if you want to see more about this, there's videos where I've just looked at this on the channel here, so maybe check in the description below. There's even an article I did just on that exercise that talks about it in great detail, so check the description below to see more about that. Obviously, once I've gone through my basic mobility and stability exercise, I need to start strengthening, and I want to strengthen in the horizontal plane first, but eventually I want to get into that vertical overhead things, because they're the things that are going to make the biggest difference. So firstly I start with pulling, and I want to see that I have good scapular positioning here. So you see how his elbow's out away from his body. If the elbow comes in close to his body, which he's going to do on this next rep, which is what you'll see a lot of people with neck pain do, and they move right into their pain. They're basically really jamming their scapula inwards, just like Mel was before, and the rhomboids and that are hanging onto it. So they can do this exercise, maybe don't even have pain doing it, but make no mistake, it's definitely continuing their problem, keeping it going, where they need to have this elbow away from the body like so, where the scapula is sitting in its good position, so it's not being grabbed on, and you're not encouraging these guys to kick in again. All right, so it's a simple pulling exercise can really create a lot of trouble. And just keep all your stiffness at bay. The one-arm ones, by the way, are much more beneficial because it encourages the rotation of the rib cage. So we get that thoracic mobility involved in a strengthening exercise again. Once I've got the pulling, I need to get the pushing, because the pushing is where the serratus anterior gets more involved. As we saw before, that's a huge part of the problem. Obviously, there's a huge weakness with neck pain doing these ones. Also, the pecs are involved here, so we've got to make sure that there's an even workload between the serratus anterior and the pecs, and really getting that full protraction that we saw with that kneeling push-up position Dylan did before. This is a very good exercise for helping that person really get out of their pain and developing the strength in the area where they're really lacking it. All right. So once we've got our horizontal stuff done, I could obviously move into the push-ups and stuff like that as well, but I really want to get to the overhead things, because we really need to actually strengthen that upper trapezius area, because it's being overstretched, meaning it's become so weak it can't contribute to the mechanics of the scapular movement that you've lost. And until that's addressed, you're never really going to restore your problem back to what it should be. All right, so I'm going to show you 2 exercises that I use as a stepping stone to overhead strengthening. They're like you can't go straight to military presses. So let's have a look at those. Okay, so here's the 2 exercises that I might use, and they're really good because they're working in an area that's extremely risky with someone with neck pain, but it's really minimising the risk by just these unique positions that we can get into. You can see in this video here, Mel's arm is being forced out without her having to use any muscular activity to put her arm out there, because the barbell is pushing it out. All right, so the barbell is giving her a mechanical advantage because it actually is pushing this scapula out to where we want it to be, so it sits nice and flat. All right, so we've got her in a really nice position. Now she's going to try to activate this upper trapezius area very gently by activating a shrug. Now, most people, when they shrug vertically, which does exactly what she did before and goes straight into the base of the neck there, into the base of their skull. So on this way, we can bring in that gentle, and that brings her shoulder into the alignment that we really want it. So there's her depression that she's sitting in, where under chronic tension, and then it brings it up into this position where she'll have the upward rotation, but this shoulder's not being chronically stretched. So we're just building some very basic strength into the region where she's lost a lot. All right, so this can be a very effective drill as long as you're careful. You don't list. There's no load on the bar here. We just use the bar as the load itself. As she gets better at it, we can apply a little bit at a time. I bring Dylan into the video to sort of show you the difference and see how he executes it. At first he's too wide. See how he's like too far away. That's a little bit too much angle on it. He needs to sort of reduce it. And you can see how he actually tensed up a little bit because it's a little bit too awkward. So once he sort of moves over a little bit, which I think he does in a second, there we go. So now we can, and he over shrugs it at the top. You can see that tension at the top. You don't want your head to move, so you've got to be really careful of how much you take it up. So he would be better to stop around about there and trying to imagine that he's got this scapula out wide still. So it's just a gentle pull in this direction, and it's not a vertical pull. All right, so even with a light load, you can really make some mistakes if you try to overdo it. All right, you sort of need to not apply a 10 out of 10 effort on this. It's almost like a 7 out of 10. You don't want to take it too far. All right, so that'll be one of my first ones that I do. The next one I use is where we do try to go the overhead. So bring Mel into this again, and let's fast forward this. All right, so it's where it's almost like a Turkish get-up, where you're actually leveraging your body to lean across, so you don't have to actually use the entire shoulder to do all of the work. And it again gives great opportunity for that scapula to come out and around and really wrap around to lift, to guide the arm overhead, as opposed to the deltoids and the traps and everything doing it by itself. And you'll see as she's getting better, she starts to lean over a bit more, and that just places this good position. So I'll just pause it there, so where we've got that good scapular position there. And this is actually very, what's the word, probably like very easy to hold it there for a long time, because it's not sitting on your shoulder, it's actually sitting on your spine because of the position that she's in. So she's not sitting vertically. So it gives her a mechanical advantage to get this overhead movement, which builds some basic strength into the overhead movement. All right, so it's a stepping stone to the much more difficult ones to come. So we see Dylan here doing it a little bit, the same thing, a little bit heavier exercise. And you can see now how his feet are a little bit positioned awkward, and it's hard for him to bend over as well. So once he gets a little bit of a wider stance, then he'll be able to leverage his body a little bit more effectively. So it takes a bit of coordination when you're not used to doing this. Remember, Dylan doesn't have a neck or shoulder problem, so these videos are sometimes hard to manufacture. All right, but as he gets more and more into this, you'll see as he moves a little bit more, he'll start to move his trunk that little bit more, which gives him a lot better feeling of, yeah, that bit there. So you can see where he's moving just under his armpit, and then you'll come back down, you'll do it again. This next one's even better again. There you go. See how much he's moving now? See this position here, this is what we want. This is your serratus anterior, scapula's fully rotated, and we've sort of got an overhead movement. So there is some sort of element of the deltoids and traps working, but without it all bunching up and feeling it has to do the movement itself. We're guiding it up through the scapula. It's quite a sneaky way to get the overhead movement back, and can be very effective. You've got to be very careful, but trust me, when if someone really spends the time with this, their neck stuff starts to disappear, just like how it gradually appeared. All right, so we can slowly get rid of it through these strategies. It does take some time, and you have to work your trigger point things between sets. And there's obviously a stack of other things to do as well. So make sure you check the description on the video, because there's a lot of things I've left out. I've just given you the main things, and also how I would approach it, like with a gradual build up to the things that are going to make the biggest difference. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that video. I gave you some ideas, and we'll see you on our next one.